Had I been able to name this sermon after having written it, I probably would have instead titled it Sex, Religion, and Politics. These, of course, are the three topics we are often instructed to avoid in polite conversation. Ignoring this advice has crashed and burned more than one cocktail party or family holiday dinner, perhaps even one of yours. But I'm not only ignoring that advice this morning, I'm doing it from a pulpit. Because these three things have a big impact on how we live our daily lives and how we view the world. And I like to think that our advocating for a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and our encouragement to spiritual growth, would lead us to address some topics head on that others might avoid. Well, sex was certainly avoided as a topic when I was a kid. This, and this is true, this was back in the day when our local CBS affiliate would yank episodes of the Sonny and Cher comedy hour when she dared show too much midriff. I can count on one hand, and not use all my fingers, the times that I remember sex being addressed. One was the showing of a film in 6th grade. It was shown after school hours in the evening so that only those parents who approved and drove their kids there would be there. Apparently, administrators didn't want to risk upsetting anyone by providing youth with accurate information regarding their bodies and sexual health. Not that there was really much to worry about. The film presented the information in such an oblique manner. I remember having more questions once it was over than I did going in. But of course, by that time, we 12-year-olds had learned our shame-based lesson well. None of us asked questions during the Q&A afterwards. The other film I remember was during health class in high school. Now, this film was so old, and it was in black and white if I remember. It wouldn't have surprised me to learn it was the same film my mother watched when she attended the same school 20 years earlier. The film focused mainly on the miracle of birth, and despite the lack of color, was bloody enough to cause my best friend to get lightheaded and have to go into the hall to lie down. These two films were what public schools had to offer. Now, I later came to realize my county school system probably wasn't alone in its avoidance of responsibly providing youth with accurate and helpful information. When required to take a health class in college, the professor broke the semester into 3 topics. The first 2 were the ones she always taught because she felt they were important. The third, she always allowed the students to choose. My class chose sex education. The professor admitted all her classes chose sex education. The other students apparently wanted more information as well. And we're talking college sophomores here. Remember, this was long before the internet. Now, I promised to tie in the second taboo subject, religion, as well. I remember the Sunday morning, the topic for my high school Sunday school class was birth control. Certainly a good topic to discuss with young men with raging hormones. I remember it so well because we didn't discuss it. We arrived in the room to discover the teacher had prepared an alternate lesson. The minister and Sunday school superintendent felt the need to protect us from this information and jettisoned the pamphlet that we usually used, which contained the offending lesson. I remember feeling offended that they were so out of touch with who we were, what we needed to know, and what we were going through, that they felt it necessary and appropriate to do that. Not that some of my friends weren't going through worse at their churches. I was Methodist and they were Southern Baptist. One friend was not only terrified of premarital sex, she became afraid the devil might lead her to marry a person other than the man God intended, and she would sinfully have sex with him. So you might imagine that none of the letters in LGBTQ were mentioned in a positive light, if at all. This was not only before the internet, it was when the only gay representation in the media was Dr. Smith in Lost in Space and Paul Lynde in the center square. I learned I could be either sniveling or sarcastic. So perhaps you can imagine how pleased I was when I first learned about Our Whole Lives, or OWL, the comprehensive sexuality education curricula that UU churches not only use, but were instrumental in developing. It accurately provides information about sexual health, healthy relationships, consent, sexual orientation, and gender and sexual identity and expression. But it also addresses values, body image, peer pressure, and social media and the internet. These are all the things people throughout their lives need to be familiar with to make responsible choices for themselves, their bodies, their partners, and their families. I was talking about the title, Our Whole Lives, with Carol Burris, and she mentioned she had thought the whole referred to our entire lives. The fact that there are 7 different curricula, since the material is developmentally and age appropriate. They range from the first one for grades K through 1, all the way up to one for older adults. Having heard about the rising incidence of STDs in nursing homes and assisted living communities, I imagine that one is needed nearly as much as the more commonly taught one for 7th through 9th graders. I told Carol I had thought the whole referred to the fact that sexuality is a big component of our lives, one that too often, because of societal stigma and shame, we don't recognize and celebrate enough. So, by acknowledging that often shunned topic, we were addressing our whole lives. We agreed that it probably cleverly referred to both of these aspects when it was named. Now, Carol has just completed her work in the Religious Education Credentialing Program, and this is really a huge accomplishment, folks, and I applaud her for that. In an essay she wrote for her credentialing portfolio, she wrote about the history of comprehensive sex education here in our church. Our congregation offered About Your Sexuality in the 1970s and 1980s, helping many teens during those decades learn key information not available elsewhere. And since the introduction of Our Whole Lives, including its required training for facilitators, we offer a much more comprehensive and well-run program. Sexuality is not an easy topic to address. It is considered private and requires a great deal of self-awareness and the willingness for brave conversations. But OWL addresses these issues with appropriate developmental level topics and activities that engage and challenge. So Carol encouraged me to do a sermon about OWL. I not only thought it would fit nicely in our theme of reimagining responsibility, but how we as UUs responsibly address this important aspect of our lives. As it said in our first reading, our religious traditions affirm that sexuality is a divinely bestowed blessing for the purposes of expressing love, generating new life, and providing companionship and pleasure. In the words of Reverend Cynthia Breen, sexuality is simply too important, too beautiful, and too potentially dangerous to be ignored in a religious community. At the Dallas Church, they have historically taught the middle school OWL curricula to the 8th graders. The following year is the coming of age class, which I taught for several years. I took a break, then went to seminary, but my husband began teaching and has actually ended up teaching it longer than I did. Every spring, well, at least prior to COVID, we would take the 9th graders on a heritage trip to Boston to visit the UUA, historic UU churches like King's Chapel and Walden Pond. We would try to time it so that we would be there for the Pride Parade. The pre-parade service would be held at the Arlington Street Church where William Ellery Channing preached. After the parade, we would go to the Pride Festival with booths by different LGBTQ groups. While in Boston, we would eat on a budget, except for one dinner, when we went to a historic old seafood restaurant near Faneuil Hall. As we sat waiting for our food, the teenagers were admiring the swag that they had picked up from the booths at the Pride Festival. Pins, rainbow-themed everything, t-shirts, and of course, condoms. The waitresses were taken aback that the kids had these, and that we, the chaperones, were okay with it, even when we assured them that their parents were okay with it too. They weren't used to 16-year-olds being so candid about sexual topics. So, even despite the fact that we did have to point out that it isn't really good manners to compare condom brands and colors in even a casual dining restaurant, I was thrilled that the waitstaff learned that we advocated teaching responsible attitudes towards sex and birth control to our youth. These ninth graders had learned what the UUA website calls OWL's clear messages about the values of self-worth, sexual health, justice and inclusivity, and yes, responsibility. Now, I promised to address all three taboo subjects, sex, religion, and politics. How hard might one have to rack their brains to imagine how politics and ideas of sex and gender might collide here in the great state of Texas? Or in these United States, proudly built on the Protestant work ethic and Puritan values. As you might imagine, not very hard at any given time, but especially easy now that the governor and attorney general have set aside common sense medical protocol to try to outlaw life-saving treatment to trans youth in the state. While initially dismissed as political theater, parents became alarmed when hospitals, including Texas Children's Hospital in Houston, announced they will pause hormone therapies for transgender children in fear of legal penalties. Child Protective Services began showing up at families' homes, investigating at least 6 families with transgender children before a restraining order was issued on March 2nd. It's frightening, and it's happening here and now, not Germany in the early 40s. This is attacking the vulnerable to appeal to those without any knowledge or even desire to know about gender dysphoria, defined as the distress a person feels due to a mismatch between their gender identity, their personal sense of their own gender, and their sex assigned at birth. This is acknowledged in the American Psychiatric Association's manual, the DSM-5. And treatment for gender dysphoria may include supporting the individual's gender expression or their desire for hormone therapy or surgery. To no one's surprise, treatment does not include criminalizing the support and help given to them or accusing parents supporting their children of child abuse. This type of harassment of citizens doing the medically and morally right thing for their children is unconscionable. And the word authoritarianism springs to my mind. This is, of course, only the latest foray into making citizens' autonomy in healthcare a subject of politics. The landmark 1973 U.S. Supreme Court decision that affirmed a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction by no means ended the controversy or the discussion. Despite the Supreme Court's decision, and although, according to the Pew Research Center, about 6 in 10 Americans say abortion should be legal in all or most cases, there have been many attempts to restrict access. This includes SB 8, which limits the ability to provide abortion care in Texas beyond about 6 weeks of pregnancy, before many women would even realize they're pregnant. Fetal heartbeat bills make abortions illegal as soon as the embryonic heartbeat can be detected. Having been a hospital chaplain, I know that life is defined by brain activity, not heartbeat. So this is clearly an attempt to obfuscate the issue. Those who identify as pro-choice believe that everyone has the basic human right to decide when and whether to have children, and generally believe that others have the option to choose abortion for an unplanned pregnancy, even if they would not make that same decision for themselves. Those who identify as pro-life are focused on the life of the embryo or fetus. They often don't seem to be as concerned with the lives of women who have unintended pregnancies. Missouri's latest abortion restriction bill includes ectopic pregnancies, which occur when a fertilized egg is implanted outside the uterus. Ectopic pregnancies are never viable and can be life-threatening to the women if not removed. Those who claim to be pro-life are also often against the very methods that are proven to reduce adolescent pregnancy, opting instead for ineffective abstinence-only education. According to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, studies have demonstrated that comprehensive sexuality education programs reduce the rates of sexual activity, sexual risk behaviors, for example, number of partners and unprotected intercourse, sexually transmitted infections, and adolescent pregnancy. Yes, programs like OWL. The church of my youth didn't even teach abstinence only. They apparently thought ignoring the issues would mean that the idea of sex would never occur to teenagers. This is not responsible behavior on the part of faith leaders. I can't help but wonder, if my minister back then had been aware of something akin to OWL, would he have provided better information to us? Would scores of evangelical preachers who rail against homosexuality be more open to the truth that they are speaking from a place of poor biblical scholarship and cultural bias? There is no evidence that the negative biblical verses they point to in any way speak to same-sex relationships of love and mutuality. And the term homosexual wasn't even coined until the late 19th century. I can't help but wonder, if politicians had been taught about gender and sexual identity and expression as part of a values-based program in their church, would they be attacking trans folks and their families? If they had been given medically accurate information about sexual health, would they be passing nonsensical and dangerous laws against abortion? Would it have taken until 2015 for all 50 states to make same-sex marriage available, despite the fact there are records of same-sex marriage dating back to the 1st century? I'm excited and proud that we as UUs respect one another enough throughout our entire lives to provide developmentally and age-appropriate, medically accurate information. That way, we can make responsible decisions about our bodies, our health, and sexual relationships, not just now, but for our whole lives. Amen, and so be it.